Every father dreams of teaching his daughter to ride a bike, helping with homework, and tucking her in at night. For Eli Mercer, those simple moments seemed impossible after he lost both hands, saving 43 people from a factory explosion. When the alarm sounded at Whitmore Manufacturing, everyone ran for safety except Eli. He saw the sparking electrical panel near the gas leak and knew what would happen. 43 people would die unless someone shut off the main valve. So, this single father did what he had to do. He reached out with both hands, knowing the blast would take everything from him. 3 days later, Eli woke up in a hospital bed, forever changed. The doctors said he was a hero, but all he could think about was 7-year-old Emma waiting at home. How do you explain to your daughter that Daddy can't hold her hand anymore? But someone had been watching. Someone who would soon make a decision that nobody saw coming. What happens when a CEO, known for tough business choices, decides to do something that will change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the small ranch house on Maple Street, casting a warm glow across the hand-drawn picture taped to the refrigerator. In bright crayon colors, a little girl and her daddy stood side by side, their stick-figure hands intertwined, both wearing enormous smiles. Above them, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Me and Daddy forever." Emma Mercer had drawn that picture 3 months ago, on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn. Eli had watched her work at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to get the proportions just right. When she finished, she'd held it up proudly. "Look, Daddy, it's us holding hands." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he'd said, kneeling down to her level. "Should we put it on the refrigerator so everyone can see?" "Yes, right in the middle so it's the first thing people notice." That picture had become the centerpiece of their modest home, a testament to the bond between a father and daughter who had found their way through grief together. Eli kept it there as a daily reminder of what mattered most, not the bills that sometimes piled up on the counter, not the overtime hours he pulled at the factory, but the simple joy of being Emma's dad. Their morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. Eli would wake at 5:30, shower quickly, and start the coffee before Emma's alarm went off at 6:15. She was remarkably independent for her age, a trait born from necessity but nurtured with love. While Eli packed their lunches, peanut butter and jelly for her, leftover meatloaf for him, Emma would get dressed and brush her teeth, chattering about her plans for the day. "Mrs. Patterson said we're going to learn about butterflies today," Emma announced over her bowl of cereal, milk dribbling down her chin. "Did you know they taste with their feet?" "I did not know that," Eli replied, handing her a napkin. "That's pretty amazing. What else are you going to learn?" "About metamorphosis. That's when something changes into something totally different, but still the same on the inside." She paused, considering this profound concept. Like how caterpillars become butterflies, but they're still the same bug, just prettier. Eli smiled, always amazed by the way his daughter's mind worked. At 7, she had an old soul, something that had developed after they lost her mother. Sarah had died in a car accident when Emma was 4, a drunk driver running a red light on a rainy Tuesday evening. The grief had nearly broken Eli, but Emma's resilience had pulled him through. She seemed to understand, even at that young age, that they needed each other more than ever. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes the most beautiful changes happen when we don't expect them." The house they shared was small but filled with warmth. Eli had bought it shortly after Sarah's death, trading their apartment for something with a yard where Emma could play and a garage where he could tinker with his old Ford pickup. The mortgage stretched his factory wages thin, but it was theirs. Every creaky floorboard, every coat of paint he'd applied on weekends, every flower Emma had helped plant in the front garden, it all represented the life they'd built together. Photos lined the hallway leading to the bedrooms, Emma's first steps, family vacations to the lake, birthday parties, and school plays. Sarah smiled from many of them, and Eli made sure Emma never forgot her mother's face or voice. He'd kept recordings of Sarah reading bedtime stories, and on difficult nights, they'd lie in Emma's bed and listen together. "Daddy," Emma's voice brought him back to the present. "Yes, baby. Are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. Emma had a way of asking the most important things at the most unexpected moments. "What makes you ask that?" "Sometimes you get this look on your face, like you're far away. And sometimes I hear you talking to Mummy's picture when you think I'm asleep." Eli set down his coffee cup and knelt beside her chair. This was one of those moments that defined parenthood, when your child sees more than you realize and deserves an honest answer. "I am happy, Emma, especially when I'm with you. But sometimes I miss Mommy, and sometimes I worry about making sure I'm doing everything right for us. Does that make sense?" She nodded solemnly. "I miss her too, but I think we're doing okay, don't you?" "I think we're doing better than okay. I think we're doing great." At Whitmore Manufacturing, 15 miles across town, the day was beginning with a different rhythm. The factory employed over 200 people and had been the backbone of the local economy for 30 years. Eli had worked there for 8 years, starting on the assembly line and working his way up to floor supervisor. His colleagues respected him. He was the guy who'd stay late to help a coworker finish a difficult job, who'd cover an extra shift when someone's kid was sick, who remembered birthdays and brought donuts on Fridays. "Morning, Eli," called out Janet Morrison, the quality control supervisor, as he badged in at 7:00 a.m. sharp. "Morning, Janet. How's your mum doing?" "Much better, thanks for asking. The physical therapy seems to be helping." This was Eli. He remembered the details of people's lives, asked about their families, celebrated their successes, and offered support during their struggles. In a world that seemed to grow more disconnected each day, he was an anchor of genuine human kindness. The factory floor was a symphony of organized chaos machinery, humming, workers calling out measurements, the rhythmic sounds of production that had sustained families in this town for decades. Eli knew every inch of the place, every safety protocol, every potential hazard. He took pride in the safety record of his section, which hadn't had a reportable incident in over 2 years. Meanwhile, in the executive offices on the 4th floor of the Whitmore building downtown, Claire Whitmore was beginning her day with a different kind of routine. At 38, she was the youngest CEO in the company's history, having taken over when her father retired 5 years earlier. The transition hadn't been smooth. There were those who whispered she'd only gotten the job because of her name, others who resented her Harvard MBA and her ideas about modernizing operations. But Claire had proven herself through results. Under her leadership, Whitmore Manufacturing had increased profits by 30%, expanded into 3 new markets, and earned recognition for innovative production techniques. She worked 12-hour days, arrived first and left last, and demanded excellence from everyone around her. Her corner office reflected her personality: clean lines, expensive furniture, awards and accolades displayed precisely on the walls. There were no family photos on her desk, no personal touches that might suggest vulnerability or distraction. Claire had learned early that in business, especially as a woman in manufacturing, any sign of softness could be perceived as weakness. She'd never married, had no children, and maintained only a small circle of acquaintances she wouldn't quite call friends. Her life was her work, and her work was everything. The loneliness that sometimes crept in during quiet evenings was simply the price of success, she told herself. Some people were meant to lead, and leadership often meant standing alone, but Claire had inherited more than just a business from her father. Thomas Whitmore had been a different kind of leader, one who knew every employee by name, who attended their children's graduations and their retirement parties. He'd built the company on the principle that a business was only as strong as the people who made it run. Before he retired, he'd pulled Claire aside with a piece of advice that had stayed with her, even as she'd moved in a more corporate direction. "Remember, Claire Bear," he'd said, using the nickname he'd called her since childhood, "behind every number on our reports is a person with a family, dreams, and struggles. Don't ever forget that our success is built on their dedication." She'd nodded and filed the advice away, focusing instead on the quarterly projections and efficiency reports that demanded her attention. But sometimes, late at night in her empty penthouse apartment, she'd remember his words and wonder if she'd lost something important in her pursuit of professional excellence. That morning, as Claire reviewed production reports and prepared for a board meeting about expanding the third shift, she had no idea that her world was about to intersect with that of Eli Mercer in a way that would change both of their lives forever. She couldn't know that in just a few hours, a simple maintenance alert would cascade into a crisis that would reveal not just the character of her employees, but the person she truly was beneath all the corporate armor. Down on the factory floor, Eli was making his rounds, checking on the morning shift changeover, ensuring equipment was running smoothly, and chatting briefly with the workers under his supervision. He carried a worn notebook where he jotted down maintenance needs, productivity notes, and reminders to follow up on various issues. His handwriting was neat and careful, the handwriting of a man who took pride in doing things right. "Boss," called Tommy Hernandez, one of the newer employees, "that pressure valve on line 3 has been acting up again. Makes a funny noise every hour or so." "I'll take a look," Eli replied, making a note. "Better safe than sorry." He had no way of knowing that this simple exchange, this moment of conscientiousness about a noisy valve, was setting in motion the events that would define the rest of his life. As he walked toward line 3, checking his watch and thinking about Emma's butterfly lesson, Eli Mercer was still a man who could hold his daughter's hand, tie her shoes, and brush her hair. He was still whole. In less than an hour, everything would change. The hand-drawn picture on the refrigerator at home would take on new meaning, becoming both a symbol of what was lost and a promise of what might somehow, against all odds, be found again. But for now, in these last precious moments of normal life, Eli simply did what he always did. He took care of the people around him, one small act of responsibility at a time. The first sign of trouble came at 6:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes into Eli's shift. The automated gas detection system triggered a low-level alert, nothing unusual in a facility that worked with industrial chemicals and compressed gases. These alerts happened several times a week, usually false alarms or minor leaks that could be quickly contained. But this one was different. Eli was checking the pressure readings on line 3. When the alarm's pitch changed from the familiar intermittent beep to a steady, urgent wail. Around him, workers looked up from their stations with the mild concern of people who'd heard this sound before. Protocol was clear: investigate the source, isolate if necessary, and resume operations once the all-clear was given. "Probably just a sensor malfunction," called out Maria Santos from the packaging station. "Happened twice last month." Eli nodded, but something in his gut told him this wasn't routine. He'd been working industrial jobs long enough to trust that instinct, the one that kept you safe when machinery could kill you if you weren't paying attention. He pulled out his handheld gas detector and followed the increasing signal strength toward the northeast corner of the building. The readings climbed steadily as he approached the main utility area, where the primary gas lines fed into the facility. By the time he reached the heavy metal door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," the detector was screaming. Eli's blood ran cold as he saw the reading, 2.3 parts per million, and rising. They were approaching the lower explosive limit. He keyed his radio immediately. "This is Mercer. We have a significant gas leak in Utility Section 7. I'm seeing 2.3 and climbing. We need to evacuate now." The response crackled back. "Copy that, Eli. Initiating evacuation protocol. Get out of there." But as Eli turned to leave, he saw something that stopped him dead. Through the reinforced glass window of the utility room, he could see the main electrical panel, and one of the circuit breakers was sparking. Not the occasional small spark that sometimes happened, but steady, bright flashes that meant a serious electrical fault. The math was simple and terrifying. Gas leak plus electrical sparks equals explosion. And with the amount of gas he was detecting, an explosion here wouldn't just damage the utility room, it would level half the building. The morning shift was in full swing. 43 people were scattered across the factory floor, and the evacuation had just begun. Eli's radio crackled again. "Mercer, report your status. Are you clear of the area?" He looked at the exit door behind him, then at the sparking panel visible through the window. The smart thing, the safe thing was to run. To trust that the evacuation would be fast enough, that the electrical fault would resolve itself, that maybe the gas levels weren't as bad as his detector suggested. But Eli had never been one to trust maybes when lives were at stake. "I can see the source," he radioed back. "There's an electrical fault in the main panel. If those sparks reach the gas concentration, we're looking at a major explosion. I'm going to try to shut off the gas at the main valve." "Negative! Get out now, that's an order." Eli turned off his radio. Inside the utility room, the gas concentration was overwhelming. Even with his breath held, Eli could feel his eyes watering as he moved toward the main shut-off valve. The room was filled with a maze of pipes, gauges, and electrical conduits, a complex system that kept the entire facility running. The main gas valve was a large wheel mechanism that required significant force to turn. Under normal circumstances, it would take 2 people to shut it off quickly. Eli grabbed the wheel with both hands and threw his full weight into turning it. The metal was cold under his palms, and he could feel the resistance of the pressurized system fighting against him. Behind him, the electrical panel continued its dangerous light show. Each spark seemed brighter than the last, and Eli knew it was only a matter of seconds before one of them bridged the gap to the gas-rich air around it. The valve was moving, but slowly, too slowly. Eli's lungs burned as he fought to hold his breath in the toxic atmosphere. His hands were slipping on the metal wheel, and he could feel his strength starting to fade. But through the window, he could see workers still moving across the factory floor, not yet clear of the blast radius. Tommy Hernandez was helping elderly Frank Morrison toward the exit. Maria Santos was making sure the newer employees knew which way to go. Janet Morrison was doing a final sweep of her quality control station. Good people, all of them. People with families waiting at home. Eli thought of Emma, probably sitting in her first period class, learning about butterflies. He thought of their morning conversation, her serious question about whether he was happy. He thought of the hand-drawn picture on their refrigerator and the promise it represented. With a final, desperate effort, he threw his entire body weight against the valve wheel. Something in his shoulder popped, but the valve gave way, spinning freely as the gas pressure dropped. The hissing sound that had filled the room began to fade. That's when the spark finally found its target. The explosion wasn't the Hollywood fireball that movies had taught people to expect. It was a sudden, violent expansion of superheated gas that turned the utility room into a furnace in milliseconds. The blast wave shattered the reinforced windows, buckled the metal walls, and sent Eli flying backward into the maze of pipes and conduits. He felt the heat wash over him like opening an oven door, then the crushing impact as his body hit the far wall. There was a moment of strange clarity where he could hear the secondary explosions as other gas lines ruptured, could feel the building shake around him, could taste copper and smoke in his mouth. Then there was pain unlike anything he'd ever experienced, centered in his hands and arms, and finally, mercifully, there was darkness. The emergency responders arrived within minutes, their sirens adding to the chaos outside the damaged building. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars filled the parking lot as workers streamed out of the facility, many of them crying, some injured by flying debris, all of them alive. When the first paramedic reached Eli, he was unconscious but breathing. The medic, a 20-year veteran named Rodriguez, had seen industrial accidents before, but this one made him pause. Eli's body had shielded him from the worst of the blast, but his hands and forearms had taken the full force of the explosion. "We need a helicopter," Rodriguez called out. "Now." 43 people went home to their families that night because one man chose to run toward danger instead of away from it. They would learn later that if the explosion had happened at full gas concentration, the blast would have collapsed the entire east wing of the building. Instead, thanks to Eli's action in partially closing the valve, the damage was contained to the utility area. But the cost of that heroism was written in the careful handwriting of Dr. Patricia Williams, the trauma surgeon who met the helicopter at Regional Medical Center. Her notes were clinical and precise. Patients sustained severe thermal and blast injuries to both hands and forearms, tissue damage extensive, amputation necessary at bilateral wrists to prevent systemic infection. In the hospital waiting room, Emma sat in a plastic chair that was too big for her, swinging her legs and clutching the stuffed rabbit Eli had given her for her 6th birthday. Mrs. Henderson from next door had picked her up from school and brought her straight to the hospital, but no one had been able to explain exactly what had happened. "When can I see my daddy?" she asked for the 10th time. Mrs. Henderson smoothed Emma's hair gently. "Soon, sweetheart. The doctors are taking very good care of him." Neither of them noticed the woman in the expensive suit who had been sitting in the corner for the past 3 hours, making quiet phone calls and watching the door to the surgical wing. Claire Whitmore had cancelled her board meeting, postponed 2 conference calls, and ignored 17 emails since she'd gotten the call about the explosion. She couldn't explain why she'd come to the hospital. This wasn't typical CEO behavior usually. These situations were handled by HR and the company's insurance representatives. But something about the reports she'd received, about one man staying behind to save his co-workers, had compelled her to be here. When Dr. Williams finally emerged from surgery at 11:30 p.m., Claire found herself standing up, along with Mrs. Henderson and Emma. The doctor's expression was grave, but not without hope. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," she said gently. "Mr. Mercer is stable, and we were able to prevent any systemic complications. However, the damage to his hands was too extensive to save. We had to perform bilateral amputations at the wrists." Emma didn't understand all the words, but she understood enough. Her daddy's hands, the hands that helped her with homework, that pushed her on the swing, that tucked her in at night, were gone. In his locker at the factory, Eli's work gloves sat exactly where he'd left them that morning, still bearing the shape of his hands, still holding the memory of a man who had chosen to save others at the cost of everything he held dear. The rehabilitation schedule taped to the wall beside Eli's hospital bed looked like a roadmap to an impossible destination. Physical therapy at 9 a.m., occupational therapy at 11 a.m., psychological counseling at 2 p.m., prosthetic consultation at 4 p.m. The days were broken down into 30-minute increments, each one representing another small mountain to climb in his journey back to some semblance of normal life. Dr. Sarah Chen, his occupational therapist, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the patience of someone who had guided hundreds of patients through similar transitions. She spoke in gentle, measured tones about adaptation and independence, about the remarkable things the human spirit could accomplish when faced with new challenges. "The first thing we need to understand," she explained during their initial session, "is that you're not broken, Eli. You're different now, but different doesn't mean less capable. It just means we need to find new ways to do the things that matter to you." Eli listened politely, but privately he wondered how she could be so optimistic. When he tried to reach for the water cup on his bedside table and remembered, with a jolt of fresh grief, that he had no hands to reach with, optimism felt like a foreign concept. The phantom pain was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his new reality. His brain still sent signals to hands that were no longer there, creating sensations that ranged from mild tingling to excruciating burning. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night, certain he could feel his fingers flexing, only to see the bandaged ends of his arms resting on the white hospital blankets. "It's completely normal," Dr. Chen assured him. "Your brain is still wired to expect those hands to be there. With time and practice, those sensations will fade." But time felt like an enemy now, each day stretching endlessly, as Eli confronted task after task that had once been automatic. Eating required assistance or awkward adaptations with his arms. Getting dressed became a complex negotiation between dignity and necessity. Even the simple act of turning a doorknob required help, a constant reminder of his dependence. The hardest part was Emma's visits. She came every day after school, usually with Mrs. Henderson or one of the other neighbors who had rallied around them. Emma would climb into the chair beside his bed and chatter about her day. The butterfly unit was proceeding nicely. Her friend Katie had lost a tooth. The class hamster had learned a new trick. But eventually, inevitably, there would be a moment when she would reach for his hand to show him something, or ask him to help her with a zipper, or simply want the comfort of his touch. The confusion and sadness in her eyes during these moments cut deeper than any physical pain. "Daddy," she said one afternoon, her voice small and uncertain, "when are your hands going to grow back?" Eli felt his chest tighten. They'd had conversations about his injuries, age-appropriate explanations about the accident and what it meant for their future. But 7-year-old logic still held room for magic, for the possibility that what was lost could simply reappear. "They're not going to grow back, sweetheart," he said gently, "but the doctors are going to help me get special hands that will let me do lots of things again." "Like robot hands?" "Sort of like robot hands, yes." Emma considered this solemnly. "Will they be able to feel me when I hold them?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the complexity of what they'd lost and what they might never fully regain. Eli had asked Dr. Chen the same question and received a careful, clinical answer about current prosthetic technology and sensory feedback systems. The truth was that while modern prosthetics could provide remarkable functionality, the sensation of touch, the ability to feel Emma's small hand in his, remained largely beyond the reach of current technology. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'll always feel you here." He touched his chest with the end of his arm over his heart. "That will never change." Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense, then crawled up onto the bed to nestle against his side. "I've been practicing being your helper," she announced. "Mrs. Henderson taught me how to make peanut butter sandwiches, and I can tie my own shoes now, and I learned how to work the washing machine." The image of his 7-year-old daughter standing on a step stool to reach the washing machine controls broke something inside Eli's chest. She was growing up too fast, taking on responsibilities that should never be hers, all because her father had made a choice that saved 43 strangers but left his own child without the hands that had cared for her. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to take care of me. That's not your job." "I know," she replied matter-of-factly, "but families take care of each other. That's what Mummy used to say. Remember when you were sad about her being sick and she said we all have to help each other?" She was right, of course. Sarah had said exactly that during her final weeks, when the cancer had made her weak, but her spirit remained strong. But hearing those words from Emma now, seeing the determination in her young face, filled Eli with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm him. The factory workers had rallied around them with characteristic blue-collar generosity. A fund had been established to help with medical expenses and living costs during Eli's recovery. Workers from 3 shifts had contributed, along with supervisors, office staff, and even some of the executives. The local newspaper had run a story about the explosion and Eli's heroism, which had prompted donations from strangers across the region. Tommy Hernandez visited regularly, always bringing updates from the shop floor and stories designed to make Eli laugh. Rodriguez finally figured out how to use the new inventory system. he reported one afternoon. Only took him 3 weeks and 2 IT guys to get it straight. These visits from his colleagues were bittersweet. Eli was grateful for their friendship and support, but each conversation reminded him of the life he'd left behind, the job he might never be able to return to, the sense of purpose that had defined so much of who he was. The first prosthetic consultation was an exercise in managing expectations. The prosthetist, a soft-spoken man named David Kim, brought several demonstration models to show Eli the range of options available. There were cosmetic prosthetics that looked remarkably lifelike but offered no functionality. And there were mechanical prosthetics that could grasp and manipulate objects but looked obviously artificial. The technology has come a long way in recent years, Mr. Kim explained. We can fit you with prosthetics that will restore a significant amount of function. You'll be able to dress yourself, eat independently, even write with practice. He demonstrated a myoelectric prosthetic, a sophisticated device that responded to muscle contractions in the residual limb. Eli watched as the mechanical fingers opened and closed, the movement smooth but clearly robotic. "What about sensation?" Eli asked. "Will I be able to feel things?" Mr. Kim's expression became more cautious. Current technology provides very limited sensory feedback. Some users report being able to sense pressure or resistance, but true tactile sensation, the ability to feel texture, temperature, or gentle touch, that's still largely beyond what we can offer. The words hit Eli like a physical blow. He'd known this intellectually, but hearing it stated so clearly forced him to confront the full scope of what he'd lost. He would never again feel Emma's hand slip into his, never experience the simple pleasure of running his fingers through her hair, never know the satisfaction of working with his hands on his truck or around the house. That night, after Emma had gone home and the hospital had settled into its quiet evening rhythm, Eli stared at the rehabilitation schedule on his wall. Each appointment represented hope and progress, but also a reminder of how far he had to go. The mountain ahead seemed impossibly steep, and for the first time since the accident, he wondered if he had the strength to climb it. Dr. Chen had warned him that these feelings were normal, part of the grieving process that came with any major loss. "You're not just learning to live without your hands," she'd explained. "You're mourning them. That's healthy and necessary." But knowing something was normal didn't make it easier. As Eli closed his eyes and tried to sleep, he found himself thinking about the choice he'd made in that utility room. 43 people had gone home to their families because of his actions. 43 sets of hands were still whole, still capable of all the countless small gestures that made life meaningful. It should have been enough. It should have made the sacrifice worthwhile. But as phantom pain shot through his missing fingers and he pictured Emma learning to tie her shoes because Daddy couldn't help her anymore, Eli wondered if heroism was worth the price they were both paying. The homecoming was nothing like Eli had imagined during his long weeks in the hospital. Mrs. Henderson had worked with Emma to prepare welcome signs and balloons, and the refrigerator was stocked with casseroles from neighbors who meant well, but didn't quite know what else to do. The house looked exactly the same, but everything felt different when you couldn't reach out and touch the familiar surfaces that had once provided comfort. Emma's hand-drawn picture still held its place of honor on the refrigerator, but now it seemed to mock him. The stick figures holding hands looked impossibly simple, a reminder of connections that could no longer be made in the same way. Emma noticed him staring at it during their first breakfast together at home. "I could draw a new one," she offered quietly. "Maybe with your special robot hands when you get them." "No, sweetheart," Eli said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "That picture stays exactly where it is. It's perfect." The daily routines that had once been automatic now required careful planning and adaptation. Getting dressed took 3 times as long, with Emma learning to help with buttons and zippers. Eli had mastered eating with adaptive utensils during his hospital stay, but using them in his own kitchen, while his daughter watched, felt different, more real, more permanent. The shower was particularly challenging. The occupational therapist had recommended various adaptive devices, but the simple act of washing himself remained a humbling reminder of his dependence. Emma, with the practical wisdom of a child, had suggested they sing songs to time his showers. "That way you won't feel lonely in there," she explained, "and I'll know you're okay." So they developed a routine where Emma would sit outside the bathroom door, singing the songs they used to sing together during car rides. Her clear, sweet voice carrying through the door became one of the few moments of pure joy in Eli's adjusted life. Emma had indeed learned to be his helper, but she did it with such natural grace that it never felt like burden. She became expert at opening jars, tying shoes, and handling any task that required fine motor control. More importantly, she seemed to intuitively understand when to help and when to let her father struggle through something on his own. "Daddy's learning too," she explained to her friend Katie, who had come over for a playdate. "Sometimes grown-ups have to practice new things just like kids do." The psychological impact was harder to navigate than the physical limitations. Eli found himself avoiding mirrors, not wanting to see the reflection of a man with stumps where hands should be. He declined invitations from well-meaning friends, choosing isolation over the awkward conversations and pitying looks he imagined awaited him. But Emma wouldn't let him retreat completely. One afternoon, she appeared in the living room where he'd been sitting for hours, staring blankly at a television show he wasn't really watching. In her hands was her small piggy bank, a ceramic pig painted bright pink that had been a gift from her grandmother. "I want to give this to you," she announced, setting it on the coffee table with a decisive thunk. "Emma, what are you talking about?" "Mrs. Rodriguez at school said her daddy needed money for an operation for his back, and everyone gave money to help, so I want to give you my money to help get your hands fixed." Eli looked at the piggy bank, knowing it contained the small fortune Emma had been accumulating for months: allowance money, birthday gifts from relatives, the occasional dollar from finding a lost toy or helping with chores. By her 7-year-old calculations, it probably represented untold wealth. "Sweetheart, you don't need to process." "I counted it," she interrupted. "It's $23.47. Is that enough for robot hands?" The innocent question, asked with such earnest hope, nearly broke him. He wanted to explain about insurance and medical costs, about the complexity of prosthetic technology, about the thousands of dollars involved in his treatment. Instead, he found himself looking into Emma's determined face and seeing an echo of her mother's stubborn generosity. "Emma," he said carefully, "that's the most generous thing anyone has ever offered to do for me, but you've been saving that money for something special for yourself." "You're something special for myself," she replied, with 7-year-old logic that cut straight to the heart of everything. Eli felt tears he'd been holding back for weeks finally start to fall. Emma climbed onto the couch beside him, carefully positioning herself where she could lean against his arm without causing discomfort. "It's okay to be sad, Daddy," she said softly. "Mommy used to cry sometimes too, and you told me that crying just means your heart is too full of feelings to hold them all inside." Those had been his words, spoken during the difficult months after Sarah's death, when Emma would find him crying and worry that she'd done something wrong. Now his own wisdom, reflected back through his daughter's pure heart, offered him permission to grieve for what he'd lost. They sat together in silence for a long time, Emma's small warmth pressed against his side, her piggy bank sitting between them like a monument to love that transcended circumstances. Outside, the neighborhood went about its normal rhythms, school buses delivering children home, lawnmowers buzzing in distant yards, the comfortable sounds of ordinary life continuing around them. The knock at the door came as a surprise. Eli wasn't expecting anyone, and Emma jumped up to peer through the front window. "There's a fancy lady at the door," she announced. "She's wearing a really nice coat." Eli struggled to his feet, curiosity overriding his reluctance to face unexpected visitors. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in an expensive business suit, her dark hair pulled back in a professional style. She looked nervous, which seemed oddly out of place given her polished appearance. "Can I help you?" he asked through the door. "Mr. Mercer? My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm the CEO of Whitmore Manufacturing. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes." Eli's mind raced. He'd never met the CEO, had only seen her occasionally in the company newsletter or at company-wide meetings where she spoke from a distant podium. What could she possibly want with him? He opened the door, acutely aware of his appearance, rumpled clothes, unshaven face, the obvious absence of his hands. Claire Whitmore looked exactly as he'd expected. Professional, composed, successful. What he hadn't expected was the genuine concern in her eyes as she took in his condition. "Mr. Mercer, I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced. I've been wanting to speak with you since the accident, but I didn't want to intrude while you were recovering." "Please, come in," Eli said, stepping aside, "though I have to warn you, the place is a bit of a mess." Claire entered and immediately noticed Emma, who was hanging back shyly but studying the visitor with intense curiosity. "You must be Emma," Claire said, her business demeanor softening slightly. "I've heard you're quite the helper." Emma nodded solemnly. "Are you here to give Daddy a job? He's really good at working, even without his hands." The directness of the question seemed to catch Claire off guard. She glanced at Eli, who felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Emma, why don't you go play in your room for a few minutes while Ms. Whitmore and I talk?" "It's perfectly fine," Claire said. "Actually, I'd like Emma to hear this too, if that's okay." She settled onto the couch, looking somehow smaller in the casual setting of their living room. Her expensive clothes and perfect makeup seemed out of place among Emma's toys and the comfortable clutter of their modest home. "Mr. Mercer, Eli, I came here to thank you. What you did at the factory, the choice you made, it saved the lives of every person on that shift. I know the cost has been enormous for you and your daughter, and I want you to know that the company will do everything possible to support your recovery and your future." Eli had expected this conversation. Eventually, the official company visit, the formal expressions of gratitude, the discussion of workers' compensation and benefits. What he hadn't expected was the raw emotion he could hear beneath Claire's professional words. "I was just doing my job," he said simply. "No," Claire replied firmly. "You went far beyond any job description. You made a choice that most people wouldn't have made, and you saved 43 families from losing someone they love." Emma, who had been listening with the intense focus she brought to adult conversations she didn't quite understand, suddenly spoke up. "Did you know my daddy before he got hurt?" Claire turned to her, and Eli saw something flicker across her face, surprise perhaps, or recognition of something in Emma's innocent question. "No, I didn't," Claire admitted, "but I know about him now. I know he's the kind of person who puts other people first, even when it costs him everything." As she spoke, her gaze fell on Emma's piggy bank, still sitting on the coffee table where she'd placed it earlier. Something about the sight of it, this small ceramic pig representing a child's entire fortune, offered up to help her injured father, seemed to affect Claire in a way that surprised them all. "That's a very nice piggy bank," she said softly. "I'm giving Daddy all my money to help buy his robot hands," Emma explained proudly. "It's $23.47. Claire looked at Emma, then at Eli, then back at the piggy bank. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its corporate polish entirely. "Emma, that might be the most important $23.47 in the world." Claire's visits became a weekly routine, though she couldn't quite explain to herself why. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m., she would leave her downtown office, drive across town to Maple Street, and spend an hour with Eli and Emma. What had started as a corporate obligation had evolved into something she looked forward to, with an intensity that surprised her. The official reason was simple enough. She was overseeing Eli's transition back to work, ensuring he had the resources he needed for his recovery, and exploring what role he might play in the company's future. But if she was honest with herself, the real reason was more complicated. Something about the warmth of their small house, Emma's unguarded curiosity and Eli's quiet dignity had filled a void in her life she hadn't realized existed. During one of these visits, while Emma was showing Claire her butterfly collection from school, Eli noticed her looking at a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It showed a younger Claire with an older man in military dress uniform, both of them smiling at a graduation ceremony. "That's your father?" Eli asked. Claire nodded, her professional composure slipping slightly. "His retirement ceremony from the army. He served 30 years before coming home to build the company." "Emma, why don't you show Miss Claire your new drawings?" Eli suggested gently, sensing that Claire might want to share something she rarely discussed. As Emma scampered off to her room, Claire found herself talking about her father in a way she rarely did with anyone. "He was a decorated officer," she said, her fingers unconsciously twisting her business card. "Medal of Honor, recipient from Vietnam. But you'd never know it from talking to him. He came home and dedicated himself to building something that would employ people, support families, contribute to the community." She paused, looking around the modest living room with its family photos and comfortable furniture. "He used to say that real leadership wasn't about giving orders or making profit margins. It was about creating something that made other people's lives better. I thought I understood what he meant, but I think I've been missing the point." Eli studied her carefully. "What makes you say that? Sitting here, seeing what you and Emma have built together, what you sacrifice to protect people you work with every day. It reminds me of the values he tried to teach me. I've been so focused on efficiency and profit that I forgot the company is really about people like you." Emma returned with a folder full of drawings, settling onto the couch between the two adults with the natural ease of a child who had grown comfortable with this Tuesday ritual. "Look," she said, spreading out her latest artwork. "I drew you, Ms. Claire." The drawing showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a house, a tall figure with long dark hair, wearing what appeared to be a business suit, a man with no hands, and a little girl. Above them, in Emma's careful printing, were the words, "My family" and "Ms. Claire." Claire stared at the drawing, something tightening in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time someone had drawn her picture, couldn't recall ever being included in a child's innocent definition of family. "It's beautiful, Emma," she managed, her voice slightly hoarse. "You can keep it," Emma offered generously. "I can make another one." "I would be honored to keep it," Claire replied, and meant it completely. That evening, Claire returned to her penthouse apartment and did something she'd never done before. She took Emma's drawing to her home office and pinned it to the bulletin board beside her degrees and awards. The simple crayon sketch looked absurdly out of place among the certificates and professional accolades, but somehow it felt more important than any of them. She opened her laptop and began researching prosthetic technology with an intensity that surprised her. What she found was both encouraging and frustrating. The field was advancing rapidly, with new developments in neural interfaces and sensory feedback appearing regularly in medical journals. But the cutting-edge technology remained largely experimental, available only through research programs at major universities. Claire began making phone calls. Her first contact was Dr. Marcus Webb at Johns Hopkins, one of the leading researchers in prosthetic neural interfaces. She introduced herself as the CEO of a manufacturing company looking to understand options for an injured employee. "The technology exists," Dr. Webb explained during their lengthy phone conversation. "We've had remarkable success with neural interface prosthetics that can provide both motor control and limited sensory feedback. The challenge is that these systems are extremely expensive to develop and customize." "How expensive?" Claire asked. "For a bilateral case like you're describing, with full neural interface and sensory feedback capabilities, we're looking at somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million. That includes the surgical procedures, the custom engineering, the extended rehabilitation, and ongoing maintenance." Claire absorbed this information without flinching. The numbers were staggering, but not impossible. What troubled her more was the timeline. How long would the entire process take? From initial consultation to full integration, probably 18 to 24 months. The neural mapping alone takes several months, and then we have to custom build the prosthetics based on those maps. After ending the call, Claire sat in her office long into the night, staring at Emma's drawing and thinking about her father's medals locked away in her desk drawer. He had earned them by risking his life to save his fellow soldiers. The values he'd tried to instill in her service, sacrifice, putting others first, had gotten buried under years of corporate climbing and profit maximization. But maybe it wasn't too late to remember who she was supposed to be. The next morning, Claire called an emergency meeting with her senior staff. In the conference room where she'd presided over countless discussions about productivity and cost-cutting, she laid out a proposal that left her executives speechless. "I want to establish a medical research fund," she announced, specifically focused on advanced prosthetic technology for industrial injury victims. The initial funding will be $2 million. Her CFO, Richard Sterling, was the first to find his voice. "Claire, I understand the impulse to help, but $2 million for one employee's medical care seems—" "It's not for one employee," Claire interrupted. "It's for research that could help thousands of people. And it's the right thing to do." "The board will never approve this," warned Jennifer Martinez, head of operations. "They're already questioning some of your recent decisions." Claire had expected this resistance. Her leadership style over the past 5 years had been built on careful calculation and measurable returns on investment. This proposal flew in the face of everything she'd established as her corporate identity. "Then I'll fund it personally," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Everyone knew Claire was wealthy, but using personal funds for company business crossed lines that even the most generous CEOs rarely crossed. "Claire," Richard said carefully, "I think you should take some time to consider this. Maybe we could look at a smaller commitment, something more in line with typical corporate, charitable giving." But Claire was already thinking about her father's words, about the weight of real leadership, about a 7-year-old girl offering her entire savings to help her father. The corporate playbook that had guided her for years suddenly seemed inadequate for this moment. "I've made my decision," she said firmly. "Richard, I want you to set up a meeting with Dr. Webb at Johns Hopkins. Jennifer, start researching other prosthetic research programs. I want a comprehensive understanding of our options within the week." As her staff filed out, muttering among themselves about their CEO's unexpected change in priorities, Claire remained in the conference room, looking out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there, Eli was probably struggling with the simple task of making lunch for his daughter, and Emma was learning to tie shoes that her father could no longer help her with. Claire pulled out her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never expected to use. "Dr. Webb, it's Claire Whitmore. I'd like to schedule that meeting as soon as possible. And doctor, I think we should plan to discuss a very specific case." Hidden in her desk drawer, beneath financial reports and quarterly projections, lay her father's Medal of Honor in its worn presentation case. Thomas Whitmore had earned it by carrying wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire, risking his own life repeatedly to ensure that other men could go home to their families. For the first time in years, Claire understood that some things were worth more than profit margins, and some decisions couldn't be justified on a spreadsheet. Some choices had to be made from the heart, with the kind of courage her father had shown in very different circumstances. The medal seemed to catch the afternoon light as she opened the case, its bronze star gleaming with the weight of sacrifice and service. Claire touched it gently, feeling connected to something larger than quarterly earnings and market share. "I think I'm finally starting to understand, Dad," she whispered to the empty office. That Tuesday, when Claire arrived at the house on Maple Street, she carried with her a folder thick with research papers and contact information. But more importantly, she carried a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to admit. Emma greeted her at the door with her usual enthusiasm, and Eli welcomed her with the quiet gratitude that had become familiar. As they settled into their routine coffee for the adults, juice for Emma, updates about the week's progress and challenges, Claire found herself looking at this makeshift family with new eyes. They had lost so much, but they had each other. They faced enormous challenges, but they faced them together. And somehow, improbably, they had made room in their circle for a lonely CEO who was just beginning to remember what it meant to be part of something bigger than herself. The prototype arrived on a cold Thursday morning in February, delivered by courier in a climate-controlled case that looked more like it belonged in a spy movie than on Eli's kitchen table. Dr. Webb had made the trip from Baltimore personally, accompanied by a technician and enough monitoring equipment to fill Emma's bedroom. "This is the most advanced prosthetic system we've ever developed," Dr. Webb explained as he carefully unpacked the device. "The neural interface technology is based on research that's still years away from commercial availability." The prosthetic hand looked remarkably lifelike, with articulated fingers and a skin-like covering that was warm to the touch. But what made it truly revolutionary was the network of sensors and processors that would allow Eli to not just control it with his thoughts, but actually feel with it. The surgical implantation of the neural interface was the first step. Dr. Webb continued, gesturing to the barely visible scars on Eli's forearm, where the connecting ports had been installed 6 weeks earlier. "Now we're going to see if we can restore not just function, but sensation." Emma watched the proceedings with the fascination of a child, seeing magic performed. She'd been present for many of Eli's therapy sessions, but this felt different, bigger, more momentous. "Will Daddy be able to feel my hand when I hold his?" she asked Dr. Webb. "That's exactly what we're hoping for," the doctor replied kindly. "This prosthetic has sensors that can detect pressure, temperature, and even texture. The signals get sent directly to your dad's brain, just like a real hand would do." The fitting process took hours. Dr. Webb and his technician made countless micro-adjustments, calibrating sensors and testing neural pathways. Eli sat patiently through it all, trying to manage his expectations while hope built steadily in his chest. Claire arrived in the middle of the afternoon, her usual Tuesday visit coinciding with this crucial test. She'd been following every detail of the prosthetic development, making calls to researchers, reviewing technical specifications, and quietly ensuring that cost was never a limiting factor. "How are we doing?" she asked softly, settling into the chair beside Emma. "They're almost finished," Emma reported. "And then Daddy's going to try to pick up a penny." The first test was simple, basic motor control. Dr. Webb placed a small ball on the table and asked Eli to pick it up. Eli stared at the prosthetic hand, concentrating on the thought of grasping. Slowly, incredibly, the mechanical fingers began to close around the ball. "I can feel it," Eli whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I can actually feel the weight of it." Emma clapped her hands together in delight. Claire found herself blinking back tears she hadn't expected. But the real test came next. Dr. Webb asked Emma to place her hand gently against the prosthetic palm. "Close your eyes, Eli," the doctor instructed. "Tell me what you feel." Eli's eyes fluttered shut. For a moment, there was only silence in the kitchen. Then his breath caught. "Warm," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Small, soft." His eyes opened, looking directly at his daughter. "Emma, you can feel me?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel you." Emma carefully moved her hand across the prosthetic fingers, and Eli described every sensation, the texture of her skin, the slight dampness of her palm, the gentle pressure of her touch. It wasn't exactly like his original hand, but it was infinitely more than the nothing he'd lived with for months. "This is impossible," Eli murmured, flexing the prosthetic fingers and marveling at the sensation. "How is this possible?" Dr. Webb smiled with the satisfaction of a researcher seeing years of work come to fruition. "The neural pathways in your brain that controlled your original hands are still there. We've essentially given them new hardware to control. Your brain is doing exactly what it's always done. We've just provided a new way for those signals to be expressed. The implications began to sink in. Eli would be able to return to work, not in some limited capacity, but as a fully functional person. He could help Emma with her homework, tie her shoes, braid her hair. The simple intimacies of fatherhood that had seemed lost forever were suddenly within reach again. But perhaps the most profound moment came when Dr. Webb asked Eli to try writing his name. With careful concentration, Eli picked up a pen with the prosthetic hand. The movement was deliberate, not quite as fluid as his original handwriting, but unmistakably controlled and purposeful. Slowly, letter by letter, he wrote Eli Mercer on a piece of paper. Emma took the paper and studied it carefully. "It looks just like your name always looked," she announced with satisfaction. That evening, after Dr. Webb and his team had packed up their equipment and scheduled the next phase of calibration, Claire lingered longer than usual. Emma had gone to bed, exhausted by the excitement of the day, leaving the two adults sitting in the quiet kitchen. "I don't know how to thank you," Eli said, looking at the prosthetic hand resting on the table. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." Claire shook her head. "You saved 43 lives, Eli. If anything, we're still in your debt. But this goes so far beyond workers' compensation or corporate responsibility. You've personally invested in technology that might help thousands of people. That's not about me anymore." Claire was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her father's medals, about Emma's piggy bank, about the unexpected direction her life had taken since that first visit to this house. "My father used to say that we're all connected in ways we don't always see," she said finally. "That what happens to one of us happens to all of us, and that real success is measured by how we lift each other up." She looked around the kitchen, taking in the family photos, Emma's artwork on the refrigerator, the comfortable chaos of a home built on love rather than luxury. "I spent years building a successful company, but I think I forgot what success was supposed to mean. Watching you and Emma, seeing how you've faced this challenge together, it reminded me of something I'd lost." "What's that?" "The understanding that some things are more important than profit margins. That the most meaningful investments aren't always the ones that show returns on a quarterly report." Eli studied her face, seeing something that hadn't been there during her first visits, a softness, a vulnerability that her corporate persona had hidden. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Emma's been asking if you'd like to come to her school play next month. She's playing a butterfly in the second-grade production." Claire felt something warm spread through her chest. "She wants me to come?" She's been practicing her lines for weeks, and every time she runs through them, she asks if Miss Claire will be there to see her fly. The image of Emma in butterfly wings, looking out into the audience for her face, was almost overwhelming. Claire realized that somewhere in the past few months, this little girl had claimed a piece of her heart that she hadn't known was available. "I wouldn't miss it," she said quietly. As Claire drove home that night, the city lights blurring past her window, she thought about the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, she'd been a successful but isolated CEO, focused solely on business metrics and competitive advantages. Now, she was personally funding revolutionary medical research and looking forward to a second-grader's school play. Her father would have understood. He'd always believed that the best leaders were those who served others, who used their positions and resources to make a difference in individual lives. Claire was finally beginning to understand that real power wasn't about commanding from above, it was about reaching down and pulling others up alongside you. The prosthetic hand had given Eli back his ability to touch the world, but somehow, in the process of making that possible, Claire had found her own way to connect with something larger than herself. She'd found her way back to the values her father had tried to teach her, and in doing so, she'd discovered a family she never knew she needed. The resignation letter sat in Claire's desk drawer for 3 weeks before she found the courage to submit it. Written on her personal letterhead, it was brief and professional, giving the required 60 days' notice and expressing gratitude for the opportunities she'd been given. What it didn't mention was the real reason for her decision, that she'd finally discovered what she was meant to do with her life. The board meeting, where she announced her intention to step down, was one of the most difficult hours Claire had ever experienced in corporate life. 12 men and women who had supported her leadership for 5 years stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to anger to betrayal. "Claire, this is completely unprecedented," said board chairman Robert Hayes, his voice tight with frustration. "You're walking away from a company you've spent years building. And for what? Some charitable foundation that may never amount to anything." Claire had expected this reaction. Her proposal to establish the Mercer Foundation for Industrial Injury Recovery, using her personal funds and a significant portion of her Whitmore Manufacturing stock, flew in the face of everything the board understood about sound business practices. "The foundation will make a difference," she said calmly. "The prosthetic technology we've developed for Eli has applications far beyond one case. We could help thousands of injured workers regain their lives." "And bankrupt yourself in the process," added Sandra Morrison, the board's longest-serving member. "Claire, you're talking about walking away from a guaranteed income of over $1 million a year to chase some idealistic dream that may never be financially sustainable." But Claire had done her homework. The research potential was enormous, and there were federal grants available for medical technology development. More importantly, she'd spoken with Dr. Webb about the possibility of eventually licensing the technology to prosthetic manufacturers, creating a revenue stream that could fund even more research. "I've run the numbers," she assured them. "The foundation can be self-sustaining within 5 years. And even if it weren't, this is something I need to do." "What about your responsibility to this company?" Robert demanded. "To the shareholders who trusted you with their investment?" "I'm not abandoning the company," Claire replied. "I'm recommending that Jennifer Martinez be promoted to CEO. She knows the business inside and out, and she has the leadership skills to take Whitmore Manufacturing into its next phase." What she didn't tell the board was the conversation she'd had with Jennifer the previous week, where she'd outlined her vision for maintaining the company's commitment to worker safety and employee welfare. Jennifer had initially been skeptical, but when Claire explained the full scope of what they'd accomplished with Eli's prosthetics, something had shifted in her perspective. "You really think this foundation could make a difference?" Jennifer had asked. "I think it could change everything," Claire had replied. "Not just for injured workers, but for how companies think about their responsibility to their employees." The board meeting ended with grudging acceptance of her resignation, but Claire could see the disappointment and confusion in their faces. She was walking away from everything she'd worked to achieve, and they couldn't understand why. That evening, Eli found out about Claire's decision in the most unexpected way. He'd been watching the local news when a story came on about Whitmore Manufacturing's CEO stepping down to start a charitable foundation. The reporter mentioned that the foundation would focus on advanced prosthetic research, and Eli immediately called Claire's cell phone. "You didn't tell me," he said when she answered. "I wanted to wait until it was official," Claire replied. "I know this seems sudden, but—" "Claire, you can't give up your entire career for me. This is too much. It's not just for you, Eli. It's for everyone who's been where you are. And honestly, it's for me too." She invited him and Emma to her office the next day, wanting them to see the place she was leaving and understand why she was making this choice. Emma was fascinated by the executive suite, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive artwork, but what caught her attention most was the bulletin board behind Claire's desk. "That's my picture," Emma said with delight, pointing to the crayon drawing that hung among Claire's degrees and awards. "It's my favorite thing in this office," Claire admitted. "It reminds me what's really important." While Emma explored the office, Claire showed Eli the research she'd compiled on industrial injury statistics, the potential applications of the prosthetic technology, and the business plan for the foundation. There are over 100 zero industrial accidents in this country every year, she explained. Many of them result in permanent disability. The current prosthetic technology helps, but it's not enough. What we've developed for you could change the lives of thousands of people. Eli studied the documents, seeing for the first time the scope of what Claire was envisioning. But why give up everything you've built here? Claire was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city where she'd climbed the corporate ladder with such determination. Because I finally figured out what my father was trying to teach me, she said. Success isn't about how high you climb or how much money you make. It's about using whatever advantages you have to make other people's lives better. What if the foundation fails? What if the technology doesn't work for other people the way it worked for me? Then I'll have failed at something worth attempting, Claire replied. But Eli, I don't think it will fail. Dr. Webb is already getting calls from other researchers who want to collaborate. The Department of Veterans Affairs is interested in funding studies for military amputees. This could be the beginning of something revolutionary. Emma, who had been quietly listening while examining the awards on Claire's wall, suddenly spoke up. Are you going to be poor now, Ms. Claire? The innocent question made both adults laugh, breaking some of the tension in the room. No, sweetheart, Claire assured her. I'll have enough money to live on. I just won't be as rich as I was before. Good, Emma said matter-of-factly. Being too rich seems lonely. You're much happier when you come to our house. Out of the mouths of babes, Claire thought. Emma had identified something that Claire herself had only recently recognized, that her wealth and success had indeed been isolating, creating barriers between her and the kind of authentic relationships that gave life meaning. Emma's right, Eli said softly. You have been different these past few months, happier. Claire nodded, feeling the truth of that statement settle in her chest. I think I've been more myself these past few months than I've been in years. The transition away from corporate life wasn't easy. Claire spent her final weeks at Whitmore Manufacturing, ensuring a smooth handover to Jennifer and dealing with the inevitable media attention that came with her unusual career change. Business journalists struggled to understand why a successful CEO would walk away from a thriving company to start a charitable foundation. But Claire found that she didn't care about the external opinions. For the first time in her adult life, she was making decisions based on what felt right, rather than what looked impressive or profitable. The foundation gave her a sense of purpose that no quarterly earnings report had ever provided. The day she cleaned out her office, taking down Emma's drawing and packing away her personal items, Claire felt something she hadn't expected. Relief. The weight of corporate responsibility, the constant pressure to maximize profits and satisfy shareholders, lifted from her shoulders like a physical burden being removed. Emma and Eli came to help her carry boxes to her car, turning what could have been a melancholy occasion into something more like a celebration. Are you sad to leave? Emma asked as they loaded the last box into Claire's trunk. A little, Claire admitted, but I'm more excited about what comes next. What comes next is you get to help lots of daddies like mine, Emma said, with the confidence of someone who understood the world in simple, clear terms. As they drove away from the Whitmore Manufacturing building for the last time, Claire realized that Emma was exactly right. What came next was the chance to take everything she'd learned about leadership, resource management, and strategic planning and apply it to something that truly mattered. Hidden in the bottom of one of her boxes was the resignation letter she'd never submitted, the first draft she'd written 3 weeks earlier, full of corporate language and professional justifications. She'd kept it as a reminder of how far she'd traveled in such a short time, from a woman afraid to show vulnerability to someone willing to risk everything for a cause she believed in. The Mercer Foundation for Industrial Injury Recovery would officially launch in 6 months, but in Claire's mind, it had already begun the day. A 7-year-old girl offered her entire savings to help her father, and a lonely CEO finally remembered what it meant to be part of a family. The advanced neural interface system represented 18 months of development, 3 surgical procedures, and innovations that pushed the boundaries of medical technology. Dr. Webb had assembled a team of engineers, neuroscientists, and software developers to create what he privately considered the most sophisticated prosthetic system ever designed. But as Eli prepared for the final surgery that would fully integrate the system, the weight of expectation felt heavier than hope. "This isn't just about motor control anymore," Dr. Webb explained during the pre-surgical consultation. "The new interface will allow for complete sensory integration, touch, pressure, temperature, even subtle vibrations. You'll have hand function that's actually superior to biological hands in some ways." Claire had insisted on funding every aspect of the development, despite the mounting costs that now exceeded $2 million. The board of her former company had been right about one thing: she was risking financial ruin for what some considered an impossible dream. But sitting in the consultation room with Eli and Emma, watching the hope and fear play across their faces, Claire knew she'd made the right choice. "What are the risks?" Eli asked, the question that had been haunting him for weeks. "The neural interface requires us to implant microprocessors directly into your brain tissue," Dr. Webb admitted. "There's always a risk with any brain surgery. Infection, rejection of the implants, or damage to surrounding tissue could result in complications ranging from mild discomfort to serious neurological problems." Emma, who had been quietly coloring in her notebook, looked up with the serious expression she wore when adults discussed things she didn't fully understand but recognized as important. "Could Daddy get sick from the surgery?" she asked. Dr. Webb knelt down to her level, his tone gentle but honest. "There's always some risk with surgery, Emma, but we've done everything possible to make this as safe as we can. Your daddy is very healthy, and we have the best team of doctors helping us." "And if something goes wrong?" The question hung in the air between them. Claire felt her chest tighten as she watched Eli reach for Emma, with his current prosthetics functional but limited devices that had given him back basic independence, but nothing approaching the sensation and control the new system promised. "If something goes wrong," Eli said carefully, "we'll face it together, just like we always have. But Emma, this could give us back everything we lost. I could feel your hand in mine again, really feel it." That evening, the 3 of them sat in Eli's living room, sharing takeout Chinese food and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the enormity of what lay ahead. Emma had appointed herself the family comedian for the evening, telling knock-knock jokes she'd learned at school and performing elaborate puppet shows with her stuffed animals. But eventually, bedtime arrived, and Emma's brave facade began to crack. "I'm scared, Daddy," she whispered, as Eli tucked her into bed. "What if the surgery doesn't work? What if you're different when you wake up?" Eli sat on the edge of her bed, wishing he could stroke her hair the way he used to, with hands that could feel the silk of her curls. "I'll still be me, sweetheart. No matter what happens with the surgery, I'll still be your daddy who loves you more than anything in the world. Promise?" "I promise. And you know what? Miss Claire is going to be here the whole time. She's not going anywhere." Claire, who had been standing in the doorway listening, felt tears prick her eyes. Somehow, over the past year, she'd become an integral part of this family's support system. The lonely CEO, who had once worked 16-hour days in isolation, now found her most important role was simply being present for a frightened little girl and her father. After Emma finally fell asleep, Claire and Eli sat in the kitchen, each lost in their own thoughts about what the next day would bring. "Are you having second thoughts?" Claire asked gently. Eli flexed his current prosthetics, watching the mechanical fingers move with their precise but soulless efficiency. "Every day. But then I remember what it felt like to hold Emma's hand with that prototype, to actually feel her skin against mine. If there's a chance to get that back permanently, I have to take it. And if something goes wrong, then at least I'll know we tried everything possible, and Emma will know that too, someday, when she's old enough to understand." Claire nodded, remembering her own father's willingness to risk everything for his fellow soldiers. Some choices couldn't be made with spreadsheets and risk assessments. Some decisions required faith in possibilities that couldn't be quantified. "I've been thinking about what happens after the surgery," she said. "Win or lose, I want the foundation to document everything we've learned. Other families shouldn't have to wait as long as you and Emma did for this technology to be available. You're really going to change the world with this, aren't you?" Claire smiled, thinking of all the injured workers whose files she'd reviewed, all the families struggling with disabilities that current technology couldn't adequately address. "We're going to change the world," she corrected. "This started with your sacrifice, Eli. Everything that follows is built on what you did in that utility room." The next morning arrived grey and cold, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds overhead. Claire picked up Eli and Emma at 5 a.m. for the drive to Johns Hopkins, where Dr. Webb's team had been preparing for months. Emma had packed her overnight bag with careful precision, her favorite stuffed rabbit, the book Claire had given her about butterflies, and a new drawing she'd made for her father. This one showed a man with silver robot hands holding a little girl, both of them smiling under a rainbow. "For when you wake up," she explained, pressing the folded paper into Eli's jacket pocket. The pre-surgical routine was both mundane and surreal. Forms to sign, medical bracelets to attach, IV lines to insert. Eli changed into the hospital gown that marked his transformation from person to patient, while Emma tried to maintain her brave composure and Claire handled the logistics that hospital administrators required. Dr. Webb appeared with his usual calm confidence, but Claire could see the tension in his shoulders. This surgery would either represent a breakthrough in prosthetic technology or a devastating setback for the research they'd invested so much in. "How are we feeling?" he asked Eli. "Ready," Eli replied, though his voice carried the weight of someone stepping into the unknown. "The procedure will take approximately 8 hours," Dr. Webb explained to Claire and Emma. "We'll update you every 2 hours, but don't be alarmed if there are long periods without communication. Some phases of the surgery require complete concentration." Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and hugging Dr. Webb around the waist. "Please take good care of my daddy," she said simply. "I will," Dr. Webb promised, and Claire could see that he meant it with every fiber of his professional being. As they wheeled Eli toward the operating room, he caught Claire's eye one last time. "Whatever happens," he said, "thank you for giving us hope." Claire and Emma settled into the surgical waiting room, surrounded by other families facing their own medical crises. Emma spread her coloring books on the small table between their chairs and began working on a picture of a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, a project she'd been perfecting for weeks. "Ms. Claire?" Emma said without looking up from her coloring. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think Daddy's going to be okay?" Claire looked at this remarkable little girl who had already shown more courage and resilience than most adults ever needed to summon. Emma had lost her mother, watched her father sacrifice his hands for strangers, and now faced the possibility that experimental surgery might give them back what they'd lost or take away even more. "I think your daddy is the bravest man I've ever known," Claire said carefully, "and I think Dr. Webb is the best doctor we could ask for. But mostly, I think that no matter what happens in that operating room, you and your daddy are going to be okay because you have each other." Emma considered this, adding purple shading to her butterfly's wings. "And we have you too," she said matter-of-factly. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, covering the hospital parking lot in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Inside the operating room, Dr. Webb was making the first incision that would either restore everything Eli had lost or force them all to redefine what it meant to be whole. The advanced neural interface system waited on a sterile tray beside the operating table. 18 months of innovation reduced to circuits and sensors, and the hope that human ingenuity could bridge the gap between loss and recovery. In 8 hours, they would know if miracles could be engineered, or if some sacrifices were too great for even the most advanced technology to heal. Through the surgical observation window, Claire and Emma watched as Dr. Webb's team worked with the precision of a Swiss watch, each movement calculated and purposeful. The viewing gallery was normally restricted to medical students and fellow physicians, but Dr. Webb had made an exception, understanding that this family needed to witness the procedure that would determine their future. Emma pressed her face against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Below them, her father lay unconscious on the operating table, his head partially shaved and marked with surgical markers, surrounded by machines that monitored every vital sign. "What are they doing now?" Emma whispered. Claire consulted the surgical timeline Dr. Webb had provided. "They're mapping the neural pathways in Daddy's brain. The computer needs to learn exactly how his brain controls hand movements." The most delicate phase of the surgery involved inserting microscopic electrodes into specific regions of Eli's motor cortex, the area of the brain that had once controlled his natural hands. Dr. Webb worked with instruments so precise they could manipulate individual brain cells, guided by real-time imaging that showed his exact position within Eli's neural tissue. "We're seeing excellent signal clarity," came Dr. Webb's voice through the intercom system. "The neural pathways are stronger than we anticipated. Mr. Mercer's brain has maintained the motor patterns despite months without physical hands." Claire felt a flutter of hope. One of the biggest risks had been that Eli's brain might have lost the ability to generate the signals necessary to control prosthetic hands. But apparently, the neural pathways remained intact, waiting to be reconnected to functional limbs. The second phase involved the actual implantation of the interface devices, tiny computers that would translate Eli's neural signals into commands for the prosthetic hands. These had to be positioned with millimeter precision, threaded through brain tissue without damaging the delicate structures that controlled memory, emotion, and consciousness. "Electrode array number 1 is in position," Dr. Webb announced, testing signal transmission. On the monitors visible through the observation window, Claire and Emma could see waves of electrical activity as the computer systems detected Eli's brain signals. Even unconscious, his mind was generating the patterns that had once moved his fingers, patterns that were now being captured and decoded by the most advanced prosthetic interface ever created. "It's working," Emma breathed, her voice filled with wonder. The third phase was the most dangerous, connecting the interface to the prosthetic attachments that had been surgically implanted in Eli's forearms months earlier. This required threading microscopic wires through nerve tissue, creating a permanent bridge between brain and machine. Dr. Webb moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this procedure in simulation hundreds of times, but Claire could see the tension in his posture. Despite all their preparation, they were pushing into uncharted territory. No one had ever attempted this level of neural integration in a bilateral amputee. "Connection established to the right prosthetic interface," came the update. "Signal strength is excellent. Beginning left side integration." Emma had brought her butterfly coloring book to the observation deck, and she worked on it during the long stretches when nothing seemed to be happening. Claire watched her color, marveling at this child's ability to find calm activities while her father's future hung in the balance. "Miss Claire," Emma said without looking up from her picture, "when Daddy wakes up, do you think he'll be different?" It was a question that had haunted Claire for weeks. The neural interfaces would give Eli capabilities beyond normal human hands, enhanced strength, built-in tools, even the ability to interface directly with computer systems. In some ways, he would be more than human. But would he still be the gentle, caring man who had sacrificed everything to save his co-workers? "I think Daddy will always be Daddy," Claire said carefully. "But he might be able to do things he's never been able to do before." "Like what?" "Well, his new hands will be very strong, and they might be able to sense things that regular hands can't sense." Emma considered this seriously. "Will he still give the best hugs?" "I think he'll give even better hugs," Claire assured her. The fourth hour of surgery brought the most critical moment. Dr. Webb was ready to test the complete system for the first time, sending signals from Eli's brain through the neural interfaces to the prosthetic attachments. Even under anesthesia, they could monitor whether his unconscious mind could control the new hands. Initiating first system test, Dr. Webb announced. We're looking for any motor response in the prosthetic interfaces. Claire held her breath as she watched the monitors. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, she saw movement in the cables connected to Eli's forearms. "We have response," came the excited voice from the operating room. "Repeat, we have neural control of both prosthetic interfaces. Signal strength is stronger than our best-case projections." Emma looked up from her coloring book. "Does that mean it's working?" "It means Daddy's brain is talking to his new hands," Claire explained, her voice thick with emotion. The final phase involved fine-tuning the system, adjusting sensitivity levels, and calibrating the sensory feedback mechanisms. This was where the true innovation lay. Previous prosthetics could receive motor commands from the brain, but this system would also send sensory information back, creating a complete neural loop. "Activating sensory feedback protocol," Dr. Webb announced. "We're going to touch the prosthetic sensors and see if the brain registers the sensation." Through the observation window, Claire watched as a technician gently touched a sensor on one of the prosthetic interfaces. On the brain monitoring equipment, she could see immediate electrical activity in the regions associated with touch sensation. "Remarkable," came Dr. Webb's voice. "We're seeing clear sensory processing even under anesthesia. This level of integration exceeds all our expectations." As the surgery entered its final hour, Claire found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, Eli had been a simple factory worker whose greatest concern was making sure Emma got to school on time. Now he was the subject of the most advanced prosthetic surgery ever attempted, funded by a foundation that existed solely because one lonely CEO had remembered what it meant to care about something more than profit margins. "They're almost finished," she told Emma, who had completed 3 butterfly pictures during the long procedure. "And then Daddy will be better. Then we'll find out if we've done everything right," Claire said honestly. The closing phase involved securing all the neural interfaces and ensuring that the surgical sites were properly sealed. Dr. Webb worked with the same meticulous care he'd shown throughout the procedure, knowing that any infection or complications could undo months of preparation. Surgery completed successfully, came the final announcement. "All systems are functioning within normal parameters. Mr. Mercer is stable and responding well to anesthesia." Claire felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Emma climbed into her lap, and they held each other while watching the surgical team begin the process of moving Eli to recovery. "When will he wake up?" Emma asked. "Soon," Claire promised. "And when he does, we're going to find out if we've given him back everything he lost." Through the observation window, she could see Eli being wheeled toward the recovery room, surrounded by the machines that would monitor his condition as the anesthesia wore off. The advanced neural interface system was now part of him, integrated into his nervous system in ways that would either restore his humanity or redefine what humanity could become. The waiting was almost over. In a few hours, they would know if 18 months of hope, innovation, and determination had been enough to bridge the gap between loss and recovery, between the man Eli had been and the man he might yet become. Eli's eyes opened slowly, emerging from the depths of anesthesia like a swimmer surfacing from deep water. The recovery room was dim and quiet, designed to ease patients back into consciousness without overwhelming their senses. But for Eli, the most overwhelming sensation wasn't visual or auditory. It was the unmistakable feeling of having hands again. Dr. Webb was the first face he saw, leaning over the bed with a cautious smile. "Welcome back, Eli. How are you feeling?" "I can feel them," Eli whispered, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube. "I can feel my hands." It wasn't quite accurate. The advanced neural interface system created sensations that were interpreted by his brain as hands, but the experience was so convincing that the distinction seemed meaningless. For the first time in 18 months, Eli felt complete. "That's exactly what we hoped to hear, Dr. Ricci," Webb said, consulting the monitors that tracked the neural interface activity. "The system integrated even better than our projections suggested. Are you ready to try moving them?" Eli nodded, then concentrated on the simple thought of flexing his fingers. The response was immediate and natural. His new hands opened and closed with a fluidity that seemed impossible. Unlike the mechanical prosthetics he'd used during his recovery, these movements felt organic, controlled by intention rather than conscious manipulation. "This is incredible," he breathed, watching his new hands respond to his thoughts with perfect precision. Dr. Webb handed him a small rubber ball. "Try to squeeze this and tell me what you feel." Eli took the ball and applied gentle pressure. Through the neural interface, he could feel the ball's texture, its temperature, even the slight give as it compressed under his grip. "It's warm," he reported. "Soft. I can feel the surface texture." He looked up at Dr. Webb with wonder. "How is this possible?" "The sensors in your new hands detect pressure, temperature, and texture, then translate that information into nerve impulses that your brain interprets as touch." "Dr." Webb explained, "in some ways, your sensory capabilities now exceed normal human hands." That was when Claire and Emma were allowed into the recovery room. Emma approached the bed cautiously, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of her father with hands again. They looked remarkably natural, covered with a synthetic skin that matched Eli's complexion and moved with lifelike fluidity. "Daddy," she said softly, "are you okay?" "I'm more than okay, sweetheart," Eli replied, then extended his hand toward her. "Would you like to hold my hand?" Emma looked at the offered hand with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. This was the moment they'd all been working toward, but the reality of it felt almost too significant to trust. "Will you be able to feel me?" she asked, the same question that had haunted them for months. "Let's find out together." Emma carefully placed her small hand in Eli's new one. The sensation that flooded through the neural interface was so vivid, so completely convincing, that Eli gasped with emotion. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the delicate bones of her fingers, even the slight dampness of her palm from nervousness. "Emma," he whispered, his voice breaking with joy, "I can feel you. I can really feel you." Emma's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. "You can feel me holding your hand?" "Every bit of it. Your skin is so soft, and your hand is so warm, and you're holding just tight enough to let me know you love me." Emma giggled, the sound of pure happiness that had been absent from their lives for too long. "Can you feel this?" she asked, gently tracing patterns on his palm with her finger. "I can feel exactly what you're doing," Eli confirmed, marveling at the precision of sensation the interface provided. "You're drawing a heart, and this, a star, and now you're writing the letter E." Emma clapped her hands together with delight, then threw her arms around Eli's neck in the kind of spontaneous hug that had been impossible for so many months. "Careful of the IV lines," Dr. Webb warned gently, but he was smiling as he watched the reunion. Claire had been standing back, giving father and daughter their moment, but now Eli turned to her with eyes that held more gratitude than words could express. "Claire, I don't know how to thank you for this. You gave me back my daughter." "You already had your daughter," Claire replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "I just helped give you back the ability to feel her properly." Eli reached out with his other hand, and Claire took it without hesitation. The sensation was remarkable. Her grip was firm and warm, and he could feel the slight tremor of emotion in her fingers. "This is going to change everything," he said, looking between Claire and Emma. "Not just for us, but for thousands of families dealing with similar injuries." Dr. Webb nodded enthusiastically. "The data we're collecting from your neural interface will advance prosthetic research by decades. The level of integration we've achieved opens possibilities we only dreamed about before. What kind of possibilities? Claire asked. Enhanced strength without loss of fine motor control, direct interface with computer systems. Even the ability to feel textures and temperatures that normal hands can't detect, Dr. Webb explained. Eli's hands are now capable of things that biological hands could never do. But for Eli, the most important capability was the simplest one, the ability to hold his daughter's hand and feel the love in her touch. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental connection. "When can we go home?" Emma asked, already seeming to accept the miracle of her father's restoration as the new normal. "We'll need to keep Daddy here for a few more days to make sure everything is working properly," Dr. Webb explained. "But then you can go home and start learning all the amazing things these new hands can do." As the afternoon progressed, Eli experimented with his new capabilities under Dr. Webb's careful supervision. He could write with perfect penmanship, manipulate objects with extraordinary precision, even detect temperature variations of less than 1 degree. The neural interface had not just restored his functionality, it had enhanced it beyond human norms. But the moment that mattered most came when visiting hours ended and Emma had to go home with Claire. As they prepared to leave, Emma handed her father the drawing she'd made that morning, the picture of a man with silver hands holding a little girl under a rainbow. "This is for your room," she said, "so you remember that everything is going to be okay now." Eli took the drawing with his new hands, feeling the texture of the paper, the slight raised areas where Emma had pressed hard with her crayons. The simple act of holding his daughter's artwork, of feeling its physical reality, was more precious than any technological marvel. "I love you, sweetheart," he said, reaching out to touch her cheek with fingers that could actually feel the softness of her skin. "I love you too, Daddy, and I love your new hands." As Claire and Emma left the hospital that evening, snow was falling steadily outside, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look fresh and new. Inside the recovery room, Eli held his daughter's drawing and marveled at the sensation of paper between his fingers, a simple pleasure that 18 months ago he'd thought he'd lost forever. The advanced neural interface system had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. But more importantly, it had given a father and daughter back the ability to touch each other, to hold hands, to experience the simple physical connections that made them a family. Emma's hand, the first thing Eli had truly felt with his new prosthetics, had completed the circle of love and connection that the explosion had threatened to break forever. In touching her, he'd touched hope itself and found it warm and real and perfectly, wonderfully human. 6 months later, Claire stood before the foundation cornerstone as the morning sun cast long shadows across the construction site. The engraving was simple but profound. "The Mercer Foundation for Industrial Injury Recovery, in memory of those who sacrifice, in hope for those who heal." Below it, in smaller text, was the date of the factory explosion and a brief inscription, dedicated to the belief that every worker deserves the chance to return home whole to the people who love them. The groundbreaking ceremony had drawn representatives from medical institutions across the country, along with dozens of injured workers and their families who would benefit from the foundation's research. But the people who mattered most to Claire were standing right beside her, Eli in his new role as foundation spokesperson and peer counselor, and Emma, now 8 years old and serving as the unofficial mascot of the organization. "Daddy, tell them about your robot hands," Emma whispered, tugging on Eli's jacket as reporters prepared for interviews. Eli smiled and flexed his prosthetic fingers, the movement so natural that most observers couldn't tell they weren't biological. "They're not robot hands anymore, sweetheart. They're just my hands." The transformation in all their lives had been remarkable. Eli's recovery had exceeded every projection, and he'd become living proof of what was possible when advanced technology met human determination. His new hands didn't just restore function, they'd given him capabilities that made him uniquely qualified to help other injured workers navigate their own recoveries. The most important thing I tell people, Eli explained to the gathered crowd, is that losing your hands doesn't mean losing your ability to touch the people you love. It just means finding new ways to make those connections. Claire watched him speak with the confidence of someone who had traveled through despair and emerged stronger on the other side. His work with newly injured patients had become the Foundation's most valuable program, offering hope to people who couldn't yet imagine their own recovery. The Foundation had already approved funding for 12 research projects, partnered with 6 major medical centers, and begun clinical trials that could help thousands of injured workers. But the real measure of success was simpler: the number of families who would never have to face the choice between accepting permanent disability and risking everything on experimental treatment. "Miss Claire," Emma said, appearing at her elbow with the directness that had become her trademark, "Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you can help her husband get robot hands like Daddy's." Claire knelt down to Emma's level, still amazed by how much this child had grown in the past year. Emma had become the Foundation's unofficial ambassador, her innocent questions often cutting straight to the heart of complex medical and ethical issues. "We're going to help Mr. Rodriguez and lots of other people," Claire promised. "That's why we built this place." The Foundation's new research facility would house the most advanced prosthetic development program in the world, staffed by teams of engineers, neuroscientists, and medical professionals dedicated to pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Dr. Webb had accepted the position of Chief Medical Officer, bringing his entire research team with him. "The technology we developed for Eli was just the beginning," Dr. Webb had explained during the planning meetings. "With proper funding and facilities, we could develop prosthetic systems for every type of injury, every level of amputation. We could eliminate the word permanent from the vocabulary of industrial medicine." But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Claire herself. The lonely CEO, who had once measured success in quarterly profits, had discovered a different kind of fulfillment in the letters she received from grateful families, the progress reports from research teams, and the simple pleasure of watching Emma help her father with Foundation events. "Are you happy now, Ms. Claire?" Emma asked as they toured the construction site. It was the same question she'd asked about her father years earlier, delivered with the same innocent directness that had characterized all their important conversations. Claire looked around at the bustling activity: construction workers laying foundations for research labs, architects reviewing blueprints for patient care facilities, and medical equipment being delivered for the testing centers that would evaluate new prosthetic technologies. "I'm happier than I've ever been," she replied, and meant it completely. That evening, the three of them returned to the house on Maple Street for dinner, maintaining the Tuesday tradition that had started during Eli's recovery. The kitchen looked exactly the same, but the atmosphere was transformed by the simple presence of Eli's functional hands. Emma had insisted on cooking dinner herself: spaghetti with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a salad that was heavy on croutons and light on vegetables. As they sat around the small table, Claire marveled at how much their definition of family had expanded. "I have an announcement," Emma said solemnly, setting down her fork with dramatic ceremony. "What's that, sweetheart?" Eli asked. "I've decided that when I grow up, I want to be a doctor like Dr. Webb, so I can help give people robot hands." "That's a wonderful goal," Claire said. "But you know, you could also be an engineer or a researcher or even run a foundation like this one." Emma considered this seriously. "Could I do all of those things?" "You can do anything you set your mind to," Eli assured her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand with prosthetic fingers that felt every detail of her small grip. After dinner, while Emma worked on homework at the kitchen table, Claire and Eli stepped onto the back porch to watch the sunset. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't made that choice in the utility room?" Claire asked. Eli flexed his prosthetic hands, feeling the cool air through sensors that were more sensitive than biological skin. I think about it sometimes, but not with regret. What I did saved 43 lives, and what happened afterward brought all of us together. I can't call that anything but a blessing. Even knowing what it cost you? Claire, look at what we've built. Look at what Emma has learned about resilience and hope. Look at the foundation that's going to help thousands of families. If I had to make that choice again, knowing everything that would follow, I'd make the same decision. Inside the house, they could hear Emma singing to herself as she worked on her math homework, her voice clear and sweet in the gathering dusk. The hand-drawn picture that had started it all still held its place of honor on the refrigerator, now joined by dozens of Emma's new drawings, pictures of the foundation, of families holding hands, of butterflies emerging from cocoons with wings that sparkled like silver. She understands metamorphosis now, Claire observed, thinking of Emma's early fascination with butterflies and transformation. We all do, Eli replied. Sometimes the most beautiful changes happen when we don't expect them. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Claire realized that this small house on Maple Street had become more than just a place where she visited friends. It had become home, the first real home she'd known since her father's death, filled with the kind of love that couldn't be bought or earned through corporate success. The foundation cornerstone would weather decades of changing seasons, serving as a permanent reminder of what was possible when people chose to reach out for each other. But the real monument to their journey was simpler and more profound: a father's ability to hold his daughter's hand, a lonely woman's discovery of family, and a child's understanding that love could transform any loss into hope. Emma appeared in the doorway, backpack packed for school the next day, ready for bedtime stories and the comfortable routines of a life built on connections that were stronger than any technology. "Are you coming in?" she asked. "It's time for our story." Claire and Eli exchanged a look that needed no words, two adults who had learned that the most important hands weren't necessarily the ones you were born with, but the ones you chose to reach out with, again and again, until you found the people who made reaching worthwhile. The Mercer Foundation for Industrial Injury Recovery would go on to revolutionize prosthetic medicine, helping thousands of injured workers reclaim their lives and their connections to the people they loved. But its true success would always be measured in simpler terms, in the sound of Emma's laughter, in the warmth of hands that could feel and be felt, and in the understanding that sometimes the most profound miracles begin with the choice to save someone else, even when the cost seems too great to bear. As they walked inside together, Claire couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. She'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, accumulating wealth and power and professional accolades. But the most important thing she'd ever accomplished was learning to be part of a family that chose each other, one Tuesday visit at a time, until choosing became loving, and loving became home.